In late December 1795, a young man knocks at the door of a stately house in Frankfurt, Germany. The house is that of Jacob Gontard, a well-to-do banker who lives here with his wife and children. The young, idealistic, well-educated man is Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet at heart, but a private tutor out of necessity. He has no clue what he will find inside. He doesn't know yet that something extraordinary is about to happen, something that will change his life profoundly. He doesn't suspect that behind this door he will find the greatest bliss as well as the greatest anguish. He is blissfully unaware that he is about to meet the love of his life. Hello there, I'm the Hapless Romantic, and today I would like to tell you the moving love story between Friedrich Hölderlin and Susette Gontard. Due to the sheer amount of material I would like to go through, I have decided to split the whole topic into 3 separate videos. So this is the first of a total of 3 parts. And you can find the links to the other 2 parts both in the video description and at the end of this video. So, who was Friedrich Hölderlin? Well, he was a famous German poet, and I have already made a whole video dedicated solely to him, where I tried to explain just why he holds such a special place in my heart. So in this video I will only give a brief summary of Hölderlin's life and mainly stick to the stuff that's relevant to the relationship between him and Susette. This is a rather long story and I have already tried my best to condense it, but there are just too many details that are just too good to be left out. So, make yourself comfortable and let's dive in. Friedrich Hölderlin was born in 1770 in the German town of Laufen am Neckar. Since his early youth, he loved ancient Greece and all its classical authors, which he tried to emulate in his poetry. For him, the ancient world with all its gods and heroes represented an ideal, a golden age. And in contrast, he was very much at odds with his own times. In his view, the modern world was lacking in a fundamental way. He thought that man's soul had become impoverished, that modern man had become incapable of living in harmony with nature, gracefully and beautifully, that man was no longer capable of feeling true love and brotherhood. Hölderlin strived for the ancient ideal of the beautiful soul, a soul that lives in harmony with itself and its surroundings. The ancient concept of the beautiful soul refers to the inner moral beauty of a dignified, harmoniously balanced character. The beautiful soul is the harmonious unity of sensuality and spirit, emotion and reason. It is capable of overcoming the conflict within human beings between their nature and their spirit. It is in harmony with both the physical and the divine, according to Hölderlin's understanding of the divine. Hölderlin assumed an original unity that has been lost, but which humans constantly strive for. The beautiful soul is capable of restoring this universal unity within itself. It has not become alienated from nature through its mind, but can unite both. For Hölderlin, human beings possess an inherent divinity, but they are often unaware of it and must first become conscious of it again. The beautiful soul is a soul whose fundamental form is love. And for Hölderlin, this love holds the power to reconcile all of the contradictory forces of existence, to restore a beautiful, perfect harmony. And beauty also plays a central role for Hölderlin in all of this. Beauty is not only the characteristic of a perfect soul, but also the manifestation of the divine in the material. As he says, beauty is the divine in sensual form. And I admire Hölderlin for his lofty ideals, and I share them with him wholeheartedly. I must say that I see Hölderlin not only as a role model, but also as a kind of a soulmate and brother in arms in a way. Because not only do I share his ideals and his dreams and ambitions, but also his very fragile disposition. Hölderlin was a very sensitive soul, very irritable and prone to nervous breakdowns. And all his life he suffered greatly under the rather insensitive nature of his fellow human beings. He had a keen sense of beauty, and everything he did in the name of love and of beauty. And naturally, he longed for like-minded souls, but unsurprisingly, he found only very few. Where are all the beautiful souls? I ask myself. Well, as far as Hölderlin is concerned, despite everything he had to endure, he nonetheless had the great fortune and the extraordinary, incredible, almost outrageous luck to have met at least one such soul, in which he found his longings and ideals seemingly fulfilled. And here we come to Susette Gontard. Susette was the wife of Jacob Gontard. They were distant cousins, and Susette was only 17 when they married. It was, as it was quite common back then, an arranged marriage. Love was not part of the equation. They had 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. Susette came from a wealthy merchant family from Hamburg. She had enjoyed a good education, spoke several languages, sang and played the piano, was well read, and had a keen interest in literature. By all accounts, she must have been quite beautiful. Several contemporary accounts praise her Greek beauty, her white skin, her dark eyes, and black hair. Apparently, Hölderlin was not the first to fall in love with her. She had a close friend who adored her passionately, and Hölderlin seems to have been a little jealous of him. Susette had to assure him that there was only friendship between them, nothing more. There is both a portrait and a bust of her. However, the portrait is very poor and does not do her justice. The bust, on the other hand, is probably a better likeness. As far as I know, there are 4 different versions of this bust, but they all look the same. Here you can see the idealized image of a Greek goddess brought to life. And it was this image with whom Hölderlin fell in love. In her, he had found the beautiful kindred spirit he had been longing for. In one of his letters, he describes her thus, quote, "There is a being in this world on which my mind can dwell for millennia. Loveliness and majesty, tranquility and life, spirit and mind and form are all blissfully united in this being." End quote. And in another one, he gives a very similar description. Quote, majesty and tenderness, and cheerfulness and seriousness, and sweet playfulness, and deep sorrow and life and spirit. Everything is united in and around her into a divine whole. End quote. And that's the quintessential definition of the beautiful soul. Now, Hölderlin was hired by Jacob Gontard as a private tutor for his son Henry. Back then, in Hölderlin's time, it was common practice for children of well-to-do parents to be educated at home, to get a private education. And Hölderlin, who had a degree in theology and who, according to his mother's wishes, was actually supposed to become a priest, used this job as pretext, so he would not have to take the cloth. He wanted to be a poet, not a priest. The first tender buds of their love must have sprung up quite soon after his arrival. Unfortunately, we have no account of this early period of their love. We can only wonder what effect Susette must have had on Hölderlin when he first met her, and vice versa. What did they think of each other? Did they fall in love instantly, or did their mutual love and appreciation develop gradually over time? What was the initial spark of their affection? What was it that made them realize that they have feelings for each other? When and how did they declare their love? And who made the first step? Did he approach her or she him? What did they say? How did they react? Was it endearingly clumsy and shy, or passionate and romantic? What did it look like, that moment of revelation after which they knew for certain that they are loved? That moment of truth, of all or nothing, when you pluck up your courage, approach your beloved, and confess your love for them. Was it just one decisive moment, or several ambiguous, suggestive ones? Did he maybe read one of his poems to her and declared his love in a poetic manner? Or was it one swift moment in which their intensive, bottled-up emotions erupted in a passionate kiss or embrace? Sadly, all of these sweet musings will have to remain in the realm of fancy and speculation. But it is so moving and so heartwarming, thinking about how first they pined for each other in silence, and then they made their move. They conquered their fears. They spoke the magic words and found their happy ending. They got that blessed validation of not only loving, but also being loved in return, being validated by the other, by the single person upon whom our entire happiness depends, whose response decides whether we soar in heavenly triumph or crush in utter despair. And when all goes well, that eruption of joy after such a long build-up, after such a long harrowing period of secret pining and longing and hoping, it's so sweet, so overwhelming, so ecstatic. It's pure happiness. There is nothing that can compare to this, to that triumphant exaltation. I love that early stage of love, when it first develops and you laugh silently from afar, and then you take the big risk, you plunge into that volcano and confess your love. All of this, these young and tender blossoms of love. This is so precious, so holy, so sacred, and so moving. There is such tenderness and vulnerability when you are in that state. Your trembling heart is laid bare, and the tiniest hint of a prickle can cause irreparable damage. Provided, of course, you are a sensitive soul and not a brute. And who knows, maybe it's a good thing that we don't know exactly how it went down between Hölderlin and Susette, how they found each other. Because that way we can revel in the succulent richness of our own imagination and imagine it even better, even more splendid and grandiose. So, however it may have happened, by May 1796 their love was in full swing. It is around this time that Hölderlin begins writing about her in his letters, but he couldn't go into any specific details due to the fear of being discovered. He could only hint at his current state of happiness. And so, for a while, the lovers found themselves in their own little paradise, mostly undisturbed by the outside world. I like to imagine how they must have lived for those brief moments when they were unobserved and could express their love freely and openly. For example, when they met in the hallway, on the stairs, or on the way to their separate rooms, or when they went into the garden. And how they must have constantly exchanged silent, meaningful glances and basked in the secret happiness of their love. Like, for example, when Hölderlin had lunch or dinner with the whole family and sat at the same table as Susette and her husband. I imagine it must have been very stressful and burdensome, and also, at the same time, very exciting and exhilarating. But they were quite lucky in that her husband was rarely at home. When he wasn't occupied by his work, he liked to spend his evenings at his clubs, playing cards and so forth. Susette and her husband were never very close, and it seems that quite soon after her wedding she felt lonely and neglected. And this fact certainly contributed to her willingness and her readiness to enter such a passionate affair with Hölderlin. She was emotionally starved, and she was just as romantically inclined as he was, and just as soulful. And so, when her husband was away, they found comfort and security in their daily little routines. In the morning, Hölderlin would tutor her son, and quite often she would join them and sit in on the lessons. In the afternoon, they would sit in the garden or go for walks, and in the evenings they would either make music together, Susette would play the piano and Hölderlin the flute, or they would read to each other. And quite often, Hölderlin would read from his own works, either from his poems or from the novel he was working on. The novel was called Hyperion, and it is of great significance for our story because it is deeply influenced by his relationship with Susette. Hyperion, the main character, is a very thinly disguised version of Hölderlin himself. He is a young idealistic Greek who longs for the glory of ancient days and fights against the Turks in the Greek War of Independence. But he gets disillusioned, not only by his fellow countrymen, but by humanity as such. And in the end, he decides to become a hermit. Like Hölderlin, he feels the calling to become a poet, a voice for the divine forces that govern life and give it beauty and meaning. But he feels frustrated and inadequate. he only truly becomes a poet and a full, complete human being, one might say, through the transformative experience of love. Hyperion meets Diotima, or Diotima. The pronunciation is not quite clear. I prefer Diotima. So he meets Diotima, who functions not only as a personification of the kind of beautiful soul which I described at the beginning, but also as a kind of priestess of love. Diotima becomes the teacher of Hyperion. She's Hyperion's spiritual center and kind of a guiding presence for him. She embodies harmony, measure, and the living unity of love and the divine, teaching him that true greatness does not lie in heroic action or political struggle, but in inner reconciliation and spiritual elevation. As a priestess of love, she educates him through her being rather than through doctrine, leading him toward a higher understanding of love as a unifying, transformative force. The figure of Diotima is derived from Plato's dialogue The Symposium, where Diotima teaches the ascent from physical beauty to the idea of beauty itself. But Hölderlin transforms her into a poetic, incarnate figure, who makes this ideal experientially real for Hyperion. For Hyperion, the first meeting with Diotima is something like an epiphany, a kind of divine revelation. He is utterly transformed by it. Hölderlin describes Hyperion's experience as follows, quote, "I saw it once, the only thing my soul has ever sought, and the fulfillment of that which otherwise dwells for us only far away above the stars, which we postpone until the end of time. I felt it in the present moment. It was there, the highest. In this circle of human nature and things, it was there." End quote. And in another quote, "Surely it is the highest and most blessed gift held within the inexhaustible depths of nature, such a moment of liberation. It outweighs aeons of our plant-like existence. My earthly life lay dead. Time had ceased to be. And my spirit, unbound and risen, felt its kinship and its true origin." End quote. Through his love for Diotima, he is led back to the very center of being and feels himself once again one with everything. He feels one with the divine nature of existence. And we can assume that this represents Hölderlin's own feelings in regard to Susette. She must have had quite a similar effect on him. Meeting her seemed to him like a salvation from spiritual stagnation. He described it as the start of a new spring after a long, cold winter. In a letter to one of his friends, he wrote, quote, "You know how I have been, how disgusted I was by the mundane, how I lived without faith, how barren my heart had become, and how miserable." End quote. Life, he says, had lost all value to him. But now he felt free like an eagle, strengthened and rejuvenated. In Hyperion, he describes it thus, quote, "She was my Lethe." And, a side note, with Lethe he means the river of the Greek underworld. "She was my Lethe, from which I drank oblivion and forgot my past, so that I stood before her like an immortal, joyfully scolding myself, and as if awakened from a heavy dream, smiling at all the change that had weighed me down." End quote. Susette became his muse, his inspiration. She became the personification of Diotima for him. In the character of Diotima, he has immortalized her and created an eternal monument to their love. Surprisingly, Susette had already come into contact with Hölderlin's Hyperion before meeting him in person. She had previously read an excerpt from the first volume, which was published in a magazine in 1794. It must therefore have seemed particularly fateful to her that only a short time later the author of Hyperion had knocked on her door. The novel consists of 2 volumes. The final version of the first volume was published in 1797, and the second volume, in which the character of Diotima is introduced, and in which Hölderlin describes the love between her and Hyperion, was written during his time in Frankfurt, when he was living with the Gontards. So the second part was written under the direct influence of his romantic bliss. It was finally published in 1799, at a time where their happiness had sadly already come to a woeful end. And he secretly dedicated it to Susette with the words, "Who else but you?" or "To whom else but you?" He didn't mention her name, so nobody was any the wiser, but she knew, of course, that it was meant for her. It was their book, the child of their love, for all to see, but only for them to know. I intend to dedicate a separate video to Hyperion and discuss it in more detail because it's one of my favorite books and it really deserves its own spotlight. But this is something for a later date. I hope I will get round to it eventually. Apart from the novel, Hölderlin also wrote several beautiful poems in this period, which are also called Diotima, and which, I am sure, he must have read to Susette. In July of 1796, the Napoleonic Wars reached Frankfurt. Napoleon and his French army was at the gates of the city, and so Jacob Gontard ordered his wife to leave Frankfurt together with their children. Hölderlin and one of her close female friends was to accompany them. Originally, her husband intended her to go to her relatives in Hamburg, but quite soon after their departure, Susette changed her mind, and they traveled to Kassel instead. This was a deliberate choice. She wanted to avoid the prying eyes of her relatives and instead preferred to use this opportunity to spend some time alone with Hölderlin, far away from everyone she knew. This was the happiest time they would ever spend together, and both of them would look back on this trip with great fondness and wistful nostalgia. 1 whole month they stayed in Kassel, and from there they went to Bad Driburg and took the curative waters and therapeutic baths there. They made trips into the countryside and kept mostly to themselves. Hölderlin wrote, quote, "We lived very quietly, made no new acquaintances, and didn't need any, for we lived among magnificent mountains and forests and were our own best company." End quote. 3 months, from July until early October, they were able to live this idyllic, carefree existence before they had to return to Frankfurt. They returned to their restrictive everyday life with all its social conventions and obligations and its forced pretense must have been very difficult for both of them. And it was particularly hard for Hölderlin because due to his rather lowly position as private tutor, he had to endure constant humiliation and degradation not only at the hands of Susette's husband, but also the entire elite of Frankfurt society, with whom the Gontards associated on a regular basis. Tutors were not respected, and they were treated like servants. For Hölderlin, who had a very keen sense of his own worth, this was very hurtful. Whenever the Gontards held one of their soirees or entertained guests, Hölderlin was obliged to attend, but he was not allowed to freely interact. Mostly he just stood in the corner and was ignored by everyone. He always felt disregarded and disrespected. And Susette could do nothing to help him. She couldn't stand up for him because she didn't dare to. She feared the consequences. In his letters, he wrote disdainfully about the spiritual and emotional poverty of all these people he had to put up with. Over the following months, Hölderlin's disgruntled restlessness kept growing, until finally circumstances came to a head in September 1798. It seems that somehow Susette's husband had finally gotten wind of the affair, or at least he seemed to suspect something, because he became a lot stricter and made the two lovers feel his authority. He made them feel that he was the man of the house. It is not known how much he really knew about his wife's affair, or how he might have learned of it. Maybe some of his friends made certain remarks, or maybe a servant or someone from his household gave him a hint. It may well be that the housekeeper told him about it, because she was jealous of the lovers, as she herself seemed to fancy Hölderlin. In any case, it seems that one day an unpleasant scene occurred between the three of them. Gontard must have insulted Hölderlin somehow, and must have spoken to him in a very condescending manner. That was the last straw for Hölderlin, and it seems that he had quite a fit. We don't know the exact words that were exchanged between the two men, but at least on Hölderlin's part, they must have been harsh enough for Susette to ask him to leave the house. I can only assume that she was mortified by what had happened, and that she tried to de-escalate the situation and restore peace. Perhaps it was also an instinctive form of self-protection. At any rate, Hölderlin complied and did as she asked. He left the house early next morning without saying any goodbyes. And by all appearances, this was the end of the story. But as I said, this is only part 1. There is more to tell. So join me in part 2, where this love story will be continued. Until then, I say, good night out there, whoever, whatever, and wherever you may be. Bye bye.